Hello everyone, welcome back. So for today's lecture, we're talking about chapter 10, which is Western Europe during World War I. Here are the questions for today, and I'm going to keep this brief today because you have a movie review that's due tonight by midnight, so I felt like I'll make this shorter to be able to give you more of an opportunity to focus on that. So less questions and a shorter lecture today as well. We're talking about first Dada art, which begins in Zurich. Zurich is the neutral country in Switzerland. It became an important center for literature and later art and music. And obviously, we think about Switzerland as being kind of a financial capital as well, but it created this really interesting breeding ground for a sense of experimental art during World War I. And this is where Dada starts. This is where it begins. We're not sure exactly the start of this term, Dada. There's a couple of different theories where this word Dada comes from. The most famous version of where this story comes from, or where this word Dada, which is sort of this nonsense meaning, is that one of the German Dada artists stabbed a dictionary, and that it landed on the word Dada. Another story goes that, and this is one advanced by the by the German artist Hulsenbeck, is that they opened up a dictionary to random and pointed at it, and the word Dada, a German and a French-German dictionary, that this German word meant a child's rocking horse or hobby horse. And another artist said that in Zurich it actually started because there was these Romanian conversations between these two artists. One was German, one was Romanian, that were saying the words da 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 da, meaning yes, yes. So not sure exactly the derivation of the word Dada, but it came to mean a sort of a nonsensical, random assortment of art. And these started with these at this place in Zurich, nicknamed the Cabaret Voltaire. And the Cabaret Voltaire, Hugo Ball was one of the early practitioners that helped break in this new form of art that's kind of like controversial, trying to be thought-provoking, trying to change what had been considered art before. And you see Hugo Ball here reciting a sound poem, a poem that's sort of nonsensical, just random verbal noises, not necessarily words, in Zurich at the Cabaret Voltaire in 1916. Interestingly enough, Vladimir Lenin lived across the street from where this Cabaret Voltaire was. So this interesting breeding ground for ideas, philosophically, artistic, but also in terms of political associations as well. This photograph is an archive, basically a document showing Hugo Ball reciting his poem at the Cabaret Voltaire, and you can see these two music stands where he had the poem, and he would read back and forth, and wearing kind of this nonsensical outfit. A lot of Dada art is about mechanization, is about industrialization as well, and some of the art kind of fights that and is also against the war, that we'll see quite a bit in the work of Dada artists. Some of the three main concepts or ideas or rules, factors that really shaped Dada, first in Zurich and then later in New York, later in Berlin, where Dada becomes most kind of famous in Berlin and in Germany, is three factors, and that is Brutisme, which means noise music or noise, simultaneity, which means simultaneously, like cubism, like the idea of two things happening at one time, or to be able to show art that has a duality. And the third is chance. And a great example of these ideas, and one of the founding members of Zurich Dada is Hans Arp, who later becomes known as Jean Arp. And you see in this piece, what he did was he started with kind of like post-impressionist art and then cubist art, kind of trained in the traditional way, going to an art school, but he wanted to create a new form of art that fit into the way that the world around him was constantly kind of changing, and what seemed like at the breaking point, like the way that civilization was going, the way that war was going, industrialization, something had to give. And so for him, he felt a new way to be creative was actually to be destructive. And the story goes that he was at his house with his wife, who later became his wife, Sophie Tabur, who was another female Zurich Dada artist, and he destroyed one of his old drawings, ripped it up into squares, and randomly threw it out on the floor. And that random association or just element of chance of just where these different pieces fell, solved for him that question of what art was going to be next. So for him, this was a way of taking ideas of poetry, taking ideas of painting, an element of chance, and all kind of in this new simultaneous way, kind of being this new art. So this is also Zurich Dada. This is his wife, who I mentioned, Sophie Tabur, and she was very influential, even though some of these Zurich Dada artists tried to keep her from exhibiting. She was ultimately successful in exhibiting with the Zurich Dada artists, and she did these new portraits. She also did paintings that were similar to what Jean Arp did as well. And Arp and her ran in circles with the same artists like Paul Klee, Kandinsky, Der Bluereiter, later met artists like Picasso and Modigliani. And so there was a lot of these different ideas that were floating around, and it's sort of their version of like those popular themes like Cubism at the time. So this is kind of Dada, a new group, a new art movement related to those ideas of like what Paul Klee was doing, what Picasso was doing with Cubism, and they would have known about them. Or been very familiar with those art theories and art philosophies and kind of ways of making. So this is an example of Dada sculpture. Very few works in Zurich were made that were sculptural. Most of them were painting or these performance pieces like Hugo Ball and others in the Cabaret Voltaire. But this became very, very influential because the Zurich artists later interacted with the Berlin artists. So it influences work that we see later in Berlin. The next movement of Dada is not necessarily a completely separate version of Dada, but imagine some of those same artists that had first been in Paris, like Duchamp, seen that work, travels to the United States, and he's working in the United States, creates a new branch of Dada art called New York Dada. And remember, we had saw his piece that was a variation of Cubism, really. And when he came to the United States and had this very famous show, this exhibition called the Armory Exhibition, the Armory Show in New York. So when he traveled there, people saw paintings like this. So he made this painting in 1912. They saw this painting. They saw the very famous piece that we saw, Nude Descending a Staircase. That was his versions of basically Cubism, but with these new ideas of kind of chance and mechanization. A lot of Marcel Duchamp's work became very, very self-referential, which we'll see, because this particular piece called The Passage from Virgin to Bride, you can see that this form right here is supposed to be the bride. She becomes very anthropomorphic Cubism, more organic shapes versus geometric. So it has kind of more of a feminine feel as opposed to very masculine geometric. But think about Nude Descending a Staircase still had some elements that looked figurative, whereas this piece becomes very much abstract. And we'll see how this bride that we can see here later manifests itself into one of Duchamp's later works as well. Marcel Duchamp rejected what he called retinal art. And retinal art is art that is meant to please the eye. Duchamp said, with the world becoming different, with the world becoming highly mechanized, similar to the idea of the Dadaists, think about the futurist artists. They were basically gravitating to mechanization and to war. Dada was against mechanization, was against the war. And so they took some of the themes from futurism and as sort of as an anti-futurism manifesto. And so you can see his idea is that moving away from painting, moving away from observation, you can create this new kind of reality. Okay, so kind of hold on to that thought as we look at his work. In other words, maybe we don't need to, if we don't like painting that's about the objective world, and we're trying to create a new way of showing that through painting perhaps, or through art, creating a new way of seeing the world, then maybe it doesn't even need to be painting, which is what Duchamp is really, really famous for. We call that Duchampian. We can even see one of his famous pieces here, the Mona Lisa that he did, LHOOQ, which he called a rectified art piece. Essentially what he did was he started just to inherit things and say, because he's calling them art, they now should be viewed as art. And he nicknamed that ready-mades. So here's an example of two pieces that he did early in his career, right after the Armory exhibition. This one is called Bottle Rack, and it was essentially that, a bottle rack that he placed inside of a museum and said, this is essentially just like a sculptor would make this. Like, think about Constantine Brancusi, who would say, exploring pure form could make a piece that looked like this. But Duchamp saying, it already exists. Somebody already made this. And on the right, his very, very famous piece, Fountain, which was, again, a ready-made. It's a urinal that he essentially flipped upside down and renamed it Fountain. He signed it Armut, which is a play on the J.L. Mott Ironworks that manufactured this. It's also a take on the German word Armut, meaning poor, like the poor artist. And it's basically taking something that already exists, changing it a little bit, putting it in the context of the gallery, and now saying it's art because it's in the gallery. This is a brilliant move, and it goes to those ideas of trying to show a new way of painting and being against retinal art, or art that is pleasing to the eye. Also, we could say that that's aesthetics, right? But these two pieces have aesthetics. They have beauty. We could look at them from a purely formal perspective. Just the irony is, and Duchamp knows this, he knows this was meant to piss people off. The irony is that he didn't physically actually make them. He changed the way we see them. So a Duchampian gesture is something that changes the context of something that's already exists in the world. And Marcel Duchamp said about this work, Fountain, it was rejected from an exhibition. Now, there was this Society of Independent Artists exhibition in 1917. That's not what we're seeing here. But originally, this is a different show, different exhibition, later recreating that 1917 show in Stockholm in 1963. It took pop art until people started to really celebrate, and after Marcel Duchamp passed away, that people started to appreciate again what he did and how thought-provoking his work was. So he died in 1968, and his work became famous again in the 60s. But he did it at the turn of the century, really, really far advanced, ahead of his time. But this piece, Fountain here, he had submitted it to the Society of Independent Artists. And back then the rule was, if anybody paid $6 and was a member of this society, they could exhibit any work of their choice. The idea was, just like the originally with the independent artists, with the Impressionists, they didn't want someone to make the decisions on what was good art or bad art. You, as the artist, got to decide what you wanted to exhibit. So here we see Marcel Duchamp saying, this is what I want to exhibit. I'm part of the Society of Independent Artists, and boom, here's my piece, here's my $6, but they rejected it. And why did they reject it? Well, first of all, they said it was immoral, they said it was vulgar, they said it really wasn't art. But their main objection was he signed it Armut. Even though it's Marcel Duchamp, He signed it Armut, and they were like, oh, on a technicality, we can wash our hands of this and not put it in the show because we don't know any artist named Armut, even though they knew Duchamp had submitted this piece. So it was a way, it was a technicality to be able to, kick this work out. And it was, like I said, well ahead of its time. This is another piece that he called an assisted ready-made, which is a bicycle wheel. Literally just that, a stool and a bicycle wheel. He juxtaposes those together. It's not a ready-made because he had to do something to it, but damn near a ready-made because there's very little intervention that he had to do. Now this one, the original was destroyed. The original was lost. And this is a variation of it. And this is at the MoMA. This is in the museum in New York. And a lot of important pieces of his are in New York or in Philadelphia. Another good example of his work and how it relates to kind of stepping away from actually making paintings. And he said at one point he was done with painting. And then later he said he was done with art. He was just going to play chess. And that was his art because it was all about thinking. Which wasn't entirely true, though, because the last 20 years of his life, he was working on a secret sculpture. It took him 20 years to complete it, and it's now in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. But moving away from kind of the contrived aspects of art and working more with that Dada concept of chance, he grabbed 3 pieces of string and dropped them on the floor. He'd then cut them out, put them on canvas, glued them to canvas, and put those on glass. And then what he did is he traced those forms on a piece of wood. They're actually stretcher bars. And then he cut those pieces out, those 3 wooden slats, into the shape of each of those strings, which he called, you can see this one is the middle one here, this one is this one, and this one is this one upside down right here. And he called them 3 standard stoppages. And it's that idea of kind of moving away from the physical act of painting, but also introducing the element of chance into one's work as an artist. Now, he still continued to make art. And remember I talked about that piece, the Virgin becoming the passage from Virgin to Bride. And in that painting, there was that shape that sort of looked like a top spinning. It's repeated here. And this is probably one of his best known pieces, and it's called The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors, Even. Also nicknamed the large glass, because this idea of making a painting and then making, it still has to be physically something that you can view, right? Whether it's a ready-made or assisted ready-made or a painting, it still has the, basically the contrivances of art or the standard format of art, having a frame, being able to see it in a gallery. This is a really, really large piece, almost 9 foot tall by 6 foot wide. Big, huge piece of glass that he did this painting on. And at the bottom part are these bachelors, these potential suitors, and this chocolate machine. And here are the bachelors trying to date this virgin who is becoming a bride. And here we can see it here. And now what he did is he made the piece. It's transparent. It's on a piece of glass, replacing the typical idea of canvas. He later asked a photographer to take a picture of the dust that had accumulated on it over the course of a year. And that was the second variation of this. The third variation is as it was being shipped, since it was glass, it actually cracked and broke. That was not originally intended for this piece. But then Duchamp said, it is now finished. It's sort of this combination of his hand and chance and intervention that makes this piece finish. And it's sort of this erotic activity, like imagining somehow the idea of love or romanticism or dating being replaced by a machine, like a mechanical robot, this chocolate machine here that's spinning with these different bachelors, which become basically like outfits, like almost just like proxies for people. And here the virgin as becoming the bride, and this kind of frustration or perpetual motion or activity that becomes futile or separated in these 2 different panes, window panes of glass. Really, really interesting piece. When you look at it, it still does have a very strong visual or aesthetic experience, even though he said he was trying to make something that was against retinal art or art that is pleasing to the eye. it still is pleasing to the eye. It still is interesting to look at. And then those elements of chance, like the broken shards of glass, only add, I think, to that visual pleasing arrangement of its separate parts. So it's still art, kind of in the mechanics of art. Another artist that is hanging around New York during this time, New York artist, is Francis Picabia, who is actually a French artist. So he was born in Paris. His parents were actually of French and Cuban descent. Francis Picabia, though, moves to New York, later moved back to Europe, but was inspired in this period working with Duchamp to make art that represented that mechanization. Essentially what this is a painting of a ready-made. So it's a portrait of a friend of his, the photographer Alfred Stieglitz, who was actually influential in bringing European art, like Francis Picabia and Marcel Duchamp, and even Picasso. He introduced Picasso to a New York audience. This is a portrait of the photographer Alfred Stieglitz, and a juxtaposition of two parts from the newly invented automobile here, a gear and a brake that's sort of stuck. So it's this idea that this now, as a camera, and these two parts from an automobile actually are a better way of representing the person, Alfred Stieglitz, than a portrait of Alfred Stieglitz would be, because this idea that he's a photographer, but also he's trying to, in a feudal way, very quickly introduce Americans that were kind of stuck in realism still to modernism, coming from Europe, abstraction, cubism, all of those ideas, and it's sort of feudal. It's kind of like locked in gear, like trying to shift gears, but yet the brake is sort of stuck. It's kind of stagnant, right? And so this is a piece based on like a drawing that you would see in a reproduction of like how a camera works, but instead of it being sort of a scientific illustration, now it becomes art, which is similar to the idea of what Duchamp did, taking something out of context, putting it in a new context, and saying it is art. Now, we have this idea of taking things, changing them a little bit, and making a new statement with them. And I think Man Ray, really, really interesting artist in the United States, true American artist, born in Philadelphia, was born Emanuel Radnitsky, took the name Man Ray, which also has kind of like this already Dada sounding name. This was a piece he called Gift. Again, these were so avant-garde, so shocking that they weren't necessarily even considered important artworks at the time. Later, Man Ray recreated this piece, but he had called it Gift. He had this interesting exhibition, too, where the gallery was completely filled with balloons that obscured the things that were inside of it, and viewers were intended to pop the balloons, and then the art would reveal itself. And this piece was also exhibited in New York in 1921, and it was meant as a gift, and hence the title, to the French composer Erik Satie. And I don't know if you've ever heard the music of Erik Satie. If you haven't, go check it out. It's really, really great. Beautiful work. If you're having a tough time falling asleep, it's great music to fall asleep to. Basically, what Erik Satie did was create music that could be repeated. So it didn't matter if you played it for 3 minutes, 3 hours, or literally 3 days. It had elements that continued to repeat and create new. His work was almost like ambient sound in the room. Very simple phrases. If you've ever seen the show The Queen's Gambit, the great show about chess, which is interesting, it's a great show in its own right, but it's some of the music that the mother plays, and that is a soundtrack throughout, is music by Erik Satie, which I think is beautiful. Check it out. Next time you're having a hard time falling asleep, put some Spotify Erik Satie on. But this was meant as gift. Basically, it's an iron that you would heat, right, on a stove and then iron your clothes. But now with these tacks applied to it, with these nails, it changes the context. There's no way you would do it subverts its original intention. It now has a new meaning, and visually it's very aesthetically pleasing. So it has an art context, and it has kind of a pseudo-psychological context of like, what if I took an iron and put tacks on it and rubbed it across my clothes that I was trying to smooth out, right? It changes the intended context of it. Another thing that Man Ray invented or came up with that is very innovative, kind of along these same ideas of chance. Maybe y'all have had a photography class, maybe you took a class with Ian, and you've had the opportunity to make what we call rayographs or rayograms. Some people will call them contact photographs as well. Basically what you do is you put a pre-coded piece of photo paper in the darkroom, put objects on top of it, and then expose it to light. And anywhere it's blocked, it's going to stay the white of the paper. And however long the light hits, it's going to become gray or black in those negative space areas. So you can see the sense of the object, but also you're kind of seeing a sense of the void of the object, because you're just getting their kind of silhouette or the overall shape of them. So it's hard to know exactly what they are. So it's really interesting, these photographs that he creates. It's essentially a camera-less photograph. So similar to how Duchamp was thinking about how can we use art materials in a new way, in an innovative new way that's kind of breaking from tradition. Here, Man Ray is creating these rayographs that are photographs without a camera, but it's still using the materials. This moves us into Dada in Germany, or Berlin Dada. And during this time, there was this phrase that art is dead. And I don't think people really thought art was dead, but what they meant was the art of the past was dead. In other words, if modern art is going to change with the times, then the old ideas of art have to die, and we have to create something new. So some of those original artists from Zurich moved to Berlin. One of them is the one that we say helped to come up with the name Dada, Richard Hulsenbeck. And some other artists, there was an artist, Helmut Herzfeld, who actually changed his name to John Hartfield to be more of a pro-American gesture, kind of against Germany or against the times. And this is a piece by Raoul Hausmann, which is similar to that piece that we saw in Zurich by Sophie Tabor, Dada Head here. She was the first to do it, and he does it next. This was originally a hat stand turned into a portrait. This was originally kind of like a mannequin head turned into an art piece with these other pieces applied, similar to kind of the idea of collage or element of chance or ready-mades inspired by Duchamp. So this is one of the important first Berlin Dada artists, Raoul Hausmann. A lot of his ideas become then emblematic for all of the Berlin Dada artists. Raoul Hausmann. Mechanical head. And the idea here is that there's some element of chance, but imagining kind of like future humans, robotic, mechanical humans in response to industrialization. The artists in Berlin Dada used a lot of collage and photo montage. So collage is simply cutting of papers, but photo montage is when you collage actual photographs. So that's the definition of photo montage. Hannah Hawk was in a relationship with Raoul Hausmann. Originally, she tried to study art, but women were not allowed to study in the traditional academy. So she went to a school to be able to study art where women were allowed to study, which is interesting. I think it influences her direction. She is one of the first artists to really explore and specifically connected with Dada the issues of women's rights. So for the first time, we see a female artist directly addressing female identity and women's rights. Where do we see it in this piece? Well, this is a huge critique of men as world leaders. So up at the top here, we see some people from the Weimar Republic. So this has a really, really long, this is a really important piece, by the way, in so many ways, as being emblematic of Dadaism, but also being sort of prototypical feminist art. This title has a really long title. It's called Cut with the Kitchen Knife, Dada Through the Last Weimar Beer Belly Cultural Epic of Germany. And think about, German beer. That's like a stereotypical thing associated with Germany. She is elevating that. She's enhancing that. She's saying, like, we are sort of that cartoon version of what you think of Germans. A shorter name for this piece is Cut with the Kitchen Knife. The idea is, too, that the belly itself is being cut. The German belly is getting cut, but also this collage is getting cut. Instead of cutting something neatly with a knife, with a neat like X-Acto blade or with scissors, instead it's cut with the kitchen knife. So it feels much more violent and aggressive and rough. But also think about at the time, the domestic aspect of thinking about, stereotypically someone would say, thinking about the life of a housewife as being their place in the kitchen. So in a sense here, this is so anti so many things. It's anti that idea that a woman should be in a kitchen. It's anti-German cultural histories. It's anti-war. We see here is Kaiser William II right here. We see Einstein. This is some Weimar leaders here. There's places where it says Dada, anti-Dada, why not join Dada? So it's almost like German propaganda. Instead of come fight for the war, come fight against the war. And at the bottom, how do we know this is a feminist piece? Well, right here, this is a map of Europe with the countries highlighted in black where women have the ability to vote. So it's a pro-female piece. And it's Katie Kollwitz here. This is a German dancer, but with the head of Katie Kollwitz, who's an artist that we'll talk about. There are other German soldiers with their heads cut off and female heads replace them, kind of imagining a new society. There is a lot of symbolism in this piece of dancers, of fighters, of scientists, of people who are innovating, but also women. And this is a self-portrait here of Hannah Hawk above that map. So she's placing herself with breaking from tradition and the new wave of feminism. Really, really brilliant piece and a great use of photo montage. I love this piece. I think it shows the example of humor since the beginning of Dada, including Zurich Dada, like Hugo Ball with those sound poems. There's always been a level of absurdity and humor. And this is that German artist who took an American name, John Hartfield, and it's called Little German Christmas Tree. And at the top, it says, Aw Tenenbaum. It says, Oh Christmas tree, in German soil, how crooked are your branches. And what about those branches? Look at those branches. Notice anything? Well, it's a critique of war and it's a critique of Nazism. Look at the size of those branches. They look pretty pathetic. It's not a full, thick German Christmas tree. It's more of like the Christmas tree from Snoopy. And it's also at the top of it creates this shape of a swastika, which we see the tree holder here at the bottom. Now this is very dangerous because this is when Hitler took power, and then later at the advent of World War II, he's critical of artists and art that he doesn't think is traditional enough, objective enough, and this would have been very dangerous for an artist to be critical of Hitler and the Nazi empire at the time. Another artist during this time period in Berlin, Dada, was a bit of an outsider because he actually worked in Hanover in Germany. And he did work, well, he has a great quote where he says he met Raoul Hausmann, the very famous Berlin Dada artist, and said, I am a painter and I nail my pictures together. So this idea that he constructed his works. And this later influenced what we see as like large-scale sculptural installations or installation art, land art, site-specific art. And basically what he did is in his house, he took over the entire apartment and constructed this large three-dimensional art piece by similar idea. Instead of it being a painting, he nailed his pictures together using different materials like wood and tape and cardboard and string and pieces of metal. Things he found in the garbage, he recycled them, upcycled them. And Merzbau literally just means, Merz is a made-up nonsensical word that for him relates the spirit of art, of construction. But he continued to make this structure grow bigger and bigger until it overwhelmed and created and filled the entire apartment. He called this piece Merzbau, which meant built art or built Merz. And he wanted art to be a total work of art. In other words, to be very, very immersive. The last German Dada artist that we'll talk about is Max Ernst. Max Ernst did a lot of collage and photo montage, but he's also a proto-surrealist artist. Some of these, which we'll get in one of the next chapters, is that Dada becomes surrealism, and some of the first surrealist artists had been Dada artists. Like Max Ernst as an example. But what he did is he would kind of create these collages or photo montages and then do paintings based on them. And you can kind of see an influence of Cubism, an influence of symbolism like Marc Chagall, but also this kind of new way of imagining this scene. And this piece is called Celebes. It's this big, huge, mechanized monster, kind of looks like an elephant. And there's this cow skull head above a beautiful nude figure in the front that's been decapitated or is headless. So this is really interesting juxtaposition between horror and beauty, the kind of the macabre and living, and kind of imagining, you know, the relationship between constant war, threat of war, and politics kind of as usual. A lot of these artists were upset because during the Weimar Republic, it was a new socialist regime that they were very optimistic about, but was short-lived. Weimar Republic actually was very influential in Europe after Germany had to disband after World War I. And remember, like 1 million dead as a result of World War I. 2 million, that's wrong, not 1 million. Hold that thought. It's actually much more than that, isn't it? 10 million soldiers killed. 10 million as a result of World War I. 20 million more that were physically disabled in some way. And even more, like likewise, were psychologically impacted and had to deal with the horrors of war. So 10 million dead, 20 million in some way were physically changed by the war. And so this creates a new art movement in and of itself in Germany called New Objectivity. That is art that is directly in immediately following the results of World War I. The abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II. And, you know, kind of thinking about German expressionism as well. These artists responding to the war. Kitty Kollwitz is a great example of this new objectivity. She was trained as a printmaker, similar to Hannah Hawk. She couldn't go to the traditional art academy because she was a female. She instead went to the Berlin Art School for women only, and she studied printmaking instead of studying painting. And you can see her works. Her works are beautiful, but they're a really way of social protest, a protest of the war, and you can see the sense of grief, of suffering, of humanity. And here we see, this piece is called The Volunteers. It's this idea of people volunteering for war. And this is the drumbeat of war represented by the skeleton face, convincing these young men to sign up for the war. And Katie Kollwitz was personally impacted by the war because in 1914 her son volunteered for the war and was killed just days after entering the war in 1914. So she is personally impacted, and her work is a lot of times personally expressing her disgust with war, but also culturally the idea of war and suffering in general as well, of people during times of great stress. She's trying to show those times of social unease. This is a beautiful woodcut, a large woodcut, 35 inches by 49. That's really, really large. 3 foot by 4 foot, really large. Most times prints are on a scale of the size of a book. And she leaves, just like the German Expressionists, as she's part of that movement, she leaves the rough cut of the wood in there, which you can see in the background, those gouge marks. It's kind of like she's subtractively reducing this. Great sense of light and contrast as well. She also makes sculptures in this idea of new objectivity, a new way of making art in response to World War I and the reality in Germany. This piece is called Lamentation. She's lamenting, she's crying, she's sorrowful at the death of Ernst Barlach, who was another sculptor, another artist. And it becomes this really interesting square where she's kind of keeping the interest in this frame, but then the frame her hand becomes the frame, which is covering her face, and she's just grief-stricken. Beautiful piece. She really understands human suffering and empathy. Another artist, probably the best known artist, the principal painters and artists associated with new objectivity, is George Grosz. George Grosz actually fought in World War I. He was in the army for 2 years. And this is a piece that is critical of the war. What's this figure saying? Well, we have this doctor and these board of army generals that are asking, is this guy here fit to serve? Can he go back and serve in World War I? And you can see the kind of claustrophobic feel of the windows out here showing the city with all the smoke coming out of the smokestacks. And here we see this kind of routine of this kind of pseudo medical exercise or test to see kind of like a physical, to see if someone is fit for service. And here we say the doctor saying KV or OK, he is fit to serve. He's fit for active service. But look at how humorous or absurd that is. He's essentially a skeleton, right? And so a lot of these artists, here's another example. Otto Dix also had been associated. He comes from working class parents. He had combat experience as well, just like George Grosz. And here we see veterans coming back after World War I that are paraplegic or amputees and have had facial reconstruction. You can see this guy's missing an eye. He has this this hearing tube here because he lost his ear, he lost his hearing. So this is a hearing aid. New prosthetics that were invented as the result of World War I and the nastiness of poisonous gases, mechanized war, ammunition, tanks, new military ways of fighting, and being in the trenches was really, really difficult. We see an element of Dadaism as well with the newspapers, an element of Cubism, a new kind of way of representing, even kind of see the skeleton in the lamp here. These are veterans playing cards, called the scat players, card playing war invalids here after the war. The shock of the war, the shock of the new, and making a new form of art, this new objectivity based on the horrors, the atrocities of war. Here's another example, another piece, and this is also a print. This is an etching. He did a series of 50 etchings based on the war, and in 1924. And here we see what it was like in the trenches, on the front lines, and these half-human, half corpses, almost like zombies, fighting in this war behind the lines, barbed wire, in these foxholes, and the realities of the war. Think about how different this is from futurism that said that, in a way, the futurists said the war was a new hygiene, a way of cleaning out the old and getting rid of the old and entering into the new agreement, the new reality. But here, the Dadaists and the new objectivity artists were saying, no, war is inherently wrong. War is evil. There are no winners. Even if you win the war, there are too many casualties, too much suffering as a result of that war. The third of these three very famous painters is Max Beckmann. Max Beckmann is a German artist that later moves and emigrates to the United States. He taught at Washington University, that's not too far from us, in St. Louis, Missouri. Philip Guston had taught there, and then he replaces him and moved to the United States to escape the threat of Nazism as well. But you can see his work, and here's this self-portrait. His work was considered degenerate art in 1937, and he was part of the degenerate art exhibition. Hitler confiscated his works and other, like Kandinsky, Paul Klee, and others. And the Dada artists, Hitler was against their works. And Max Beckmann had to flee as a result. He left during the war, but returned afterwards and still didn't find the success that he wanted in this kind of post-World War II reality. So then he ultimately goes to the United States in 1947. He never really, though, fully makes work similar to the other new objectivity. He kind of does still look back. So in 1937, there were these two exhibitions. Great German art that Hitler had said was the art that was very beautiful, was traditional, was realistic. And remember, Hitler himself was an artist, a failed artist, was denied entry to architecture school when he was in art school. And so in 1937, he has two exhibitions. He confiscated a lot of art by artists, and then he mocked that work. He hung it salon style. They even ripped some of the canvases, graffiti style, painted over top of them, destroyed the works afterwards, burned them, or sold them to raise money for tanks. But he also had the great German art that was like very idealistic, like Aryan ideas of race, what Germany should do, what was great about Germany. But guess what? The Germans went, and all of them, more people, millions went and saw the degenerate art exhibition because it was the work they weren't supposed to like. It was the work they weren't supposed to see. So it was still influential. The great German art exhibition was not as popular. And that work has not aged well. I've seen a lot of it in Berlin and Germany, and they're like, what do we do with this art now that Hitler had paid for people to go make and said was the best art? It's kind of boring, kind of Hallmark style art. The museums have a tough time. What do we do with this art now? Creates an interesting, problem. But Max Beckmann wanted to return to kind of like Renaissance art as well. So with new objectivity, he still looks back. And the era in Germany with great altar painting. So this, in a way, this triptych here is essentially like kind of like a new religious experience, a new religious painting after the war and before World War II. And he said of this triptych, there was a sort of like, you can still see, it's a Christian theme recounting the life of Jesus. But what you can see is more emphasis on humanity, on empathy, on suffering. And this is what he said of his triptych in 1937. On the right wing, you can see yourself trying to find your way in the darkness, lighting the hall and staircase with a miserable lamp dragging along, tied to you as a part of yourself. The corpse of your memories, of your wrongs, of your failures. The murder everyone commits at some time of his life. You can never free yourself of your past. You have to carry the corpse while life plays the drum, which you can see down here. Max Beckmann also has a very famous piece where him and his family are being strung up and murdered by German soldiers. And for him, that was a way of saying even the German soldiers were attacking the Germans, and just there was a sense of unease, suffering throughout. I'm going to end here. Make sure you answer those questions. I want you to enjoy the process of the movie review. So watch trailers. Check out the ones that are on that list. Watch the trailers. That way you can say, hey, I really want to invest an hour, hour and a half, or 2 hours to watching this film. It's interesting to me. Don't blame me if you say, hey, I picked this one. It sucks. It wasn't interesting. Watch the trailer. See if you want it, if you're interested in it, because I think it's something that if you dig it, if you're kind of thinking about the interest of it, that, oh, this is something that I could watch, then I think you're going to relate more to it. And then briefly write about the film itself, what the art talks about, but then relate it back to this class, maybe using class vocabulary or maybe an art movement that it ties to from the book. So have fun doing that. There's some great ones on the list, and I hope you all enjoy. Peace. See y'all.